From the 1920s to the 1970s, most evangelical Protestants in America avoided direct involvement in politics. In their view, God wanted them to save souls one by one, rather than transform the nation politically. The lifestyle changes of the 1960s and 1970s, however, especially the rise of feminism, the sexual revolution, the gay rights movement, and the Supreme Court's decision in the abortion case, Roe v. Wade, from 1973, prompted some among their leaders to rethink the question. The reclusive theological writer Francis Schaeffer argued that the world was turning to sin and wickedness because so few Christian voices were raised in public against these developments. Jerry Falwell, a Lynchburg, Virginia minister, founded the Moral Majority in 1979 as an evangelical pressure group to lobby Congress and to influence elections. It quickly mobilized hundreds of thousands of voters and contributed to Ronald Reagan's election victory over President Carter in the election of 1980, even though Carter was an outspoken evangelical. It tried to reach out to Jewish and Catholic voters too, though with only limited success. More successful as an ecumenical venture was Operation Rescue, an anti-abortion action group whose members were willing to face prison on behalf of preventing abortion. Scandals rocked the evangelical megachurches in the late 1980s, but the Moral Majority passed on its mantle to a grassroots organising group, Ralph Reed's Christian Coalition, in the early 1990s. Well, the sexual revolution of the 1960s and the women's movement and the gay liberation movement all prompted a Christian conservative response in the 1970s. The sexual revolution is the name given to a variety of changes, perhaps particularly the decline of the taboo against pre- and extramarital sex. In popular culture, including Hollywood films, censorship diminished rapidly in the 1960s, and depictions of graphic sexuality increased commensurately. Writing such as Hugh Hefner's magazine Playboy, founded in the early 1950s, books like Helen Gurley Brown's Sex and the Single Girl from 1962 encouraged an open discussion of sexuality and, in fact, preached a gospel of sexual exploration. Effective contraceptives were invented in the 1950s and early 60s, particularly the anovulant pill, which made the separation of sex and procreation easier than ever before. The abortion law reform movement began in the mid-1960s, and it enjoyed an unexpected victory with the Supreme Court's decision in the case Roe v. Wade, which the Supreme Court decided early in 1973. Both advocates and opponents of the reform were astonished by this decision, which had the effect of sweeping away laws in all 50 states. The decision was far more radical than almost anybody had anticipated. The Supreme Court declared that there was a constitutional right to privacy, a right which had previously only been mentioned for the first time in a 1965 case relating to contraceptives, and that the states were precluded from interfering, especially during the first trimester of a pregnancy, for reasons relating to privacy. Another important change in the same era was the beginning of the gay rights movement. The gay rights movement came out with the Stonewall riot of 1969. Stonewall was a homosexual bar in New York, and periodically it was raided by the police. But on this occasion, in 1969, rather than fleeing, as they had done previously, the patrons stayed, fought back against the police, and chanted defiant declarations of their homosexuality, so that where traditionally being homosexual had been something about which one had to be secretive, suddenly now the idea that one ought to defiantly declare it instead started to become popular. Coming out became an important ritual. States and cities began to consider legislation to protect gay people from discrimination at work and from hate crimes, and later began to consider legislation to permit gay marriage, a point which remains intensely controversial right up to the present. Congress passed the Equal Rights Amendment in 1972, the Equal Rights for Women Amendment, and sent it to the states for ratification. This was the result of the women's movement, which had begun, or whose beginnings are usually dated, to the publication of Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, which had been published in 1963. and the creation of the National Organisation for Women, now of which Friedan herself had been the founder. It was designed to outlaw gender discrimination. Well, this combination of social and legal changes energised conservative Christian voters, Catholic and Protestant, who created a variety of resistance movements. One of the first was the Stop ERA movement. It was led by Phyllis Schlafly, a Catholic lawyer, and it was a grassroots women's campaign against the Equal Rights Amendment. Once it had passed through Congress, then it had to get the approval of 3/4 of the states before it would become part of the Constitution. Phyllis Schlafly herself had been a conservative activist throughout the 1960s. She was a passionate supporter of Barry Goldwater, the Republican candidate of 1964. And in the early 1970s, she'd been one of the most outspoken critics of the foreign policy initiative called détente. That is the idea that the Soviet Union and the United States could ratchet down their nuclear confrontation. SALT I, the first Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, had been fruit of détente. She was critical of that and had written a long book, a hostile analysis of Secretary of State Henry Kissinger from the position of the political right. It was called Kissinger on the Couch, a sort of analysis of Kissinger explaining why is he weakening our position with respect to the Soviet Union. Phyllis Schlafly feared that various women's privileges would disappear with the Equal Rights Amendment, and that women would be made to fight in combat positions in the army, as Russian women and sometimes Israelis had been made to do. And she also feared that the Equal Rights Amendment, if it became part of the Constitution, would increase the power of the federal government. The wording of the amendment authorised the federal government to take the necessary steps to enforce it. And Phyllis Schlafly foresaw vast new federal bureaucracies and powers. And as a Goldwater conservative, she was dedicated to preventing the continuous spread of bureaucratic government. Well, her movement was very successful. It prevented the necessary 3/4 of the state governments from ratifying the Equal Rights Amendment, and it never did become part of the Constitution. Stop ERA is actually one of the very best examples of grassroots activism in American history. Every time the members of state legislatures gathered to debate the issue, they found thousands of conservative women, mobilised by Schlafly's timely publicity, picketing at the state capitol buildings. In other words, from the point of view of the state assemblymen, there was immediate impact. As they arrived at the Capitol that morning, there'd be tens of thousands of women chanting against the idea of the Equal Rights Amendment. And the fact that Schlafly confined it mainly to women was itself symbolically powerful. The women were saying, we don't want the amendment. She also organised letter-writing campaigns to state assemblymen, so successfully that the necessary 3/4 of the states never did ratify, even once an extension had been granted by Congress. And some of the states even de-ratified the amendment. 35 of the necessary 38 ratified, but 5 of them later rescinded. So the Equal Rights Amendment never did become part of the Constitution. Early opposition to abortion came mainly from Catholic conservatives. The very first anti-abortion protesters were Catholics from the group around the magazine Triumph. I mentioned Triumph in an earlier lecture. This was the magazine founded by William Buckley's brother-in-law, Brent Bozell, who was a Catholic convert and had become passionately convinced that American Catholics in particular ought to follow the full magisterium, follow church teaching as it related to matters which at first glance might seem to be remote from religious life. And in particular, that had made him an outspoken critic of American conduct in the Vietnam War. Well, a group from Triumph magazine marched against the clinic of George Washington University Hospital in June 1970. This was 3 years before the Supreme Court decided the Roe versus Wade decision, when abortion law was still actually quite restrictive. But when Bozell and his friends had heard that abortions were taking place at GW, they were determined to prevent them if they possibly could. They called themselves the Sons of Thunder. They wore red berets in tribute to the Carlist militia, one of the Francoist forces of the Spanish Civil War. And they wore rosaries around their necks. They marched up to the clinic, and the police arrested 7 of them when they smashed some of the windows at the clinic and tried to force their way in. The police beat some of them up. and mistakenly believed, because of the Red Berets, that these were leftists who were paying tribute to Che Guevara. Not surprisingly, they failed to understand the iconography of this group. Obviously, there aren't many public car lists in everyday life in Washington, D.C. James McFadden was the founder of the Human Life Review after the Roe versus Wade decision. And James McFadden, again, he was one of the National Review Group. He was a longtime friend of William Buckley, and he was the business manager of National Review. I met James McFadden and asked him about the early history of the Human Life Review, and he said that to him, when he heard about the abortion decision in Roe versus Wade, it had the same kind of impact on him that the news of the assassination of President Kennedy had had on many members of his generation. He described it as his road to Damascus, the moment when suddenly his entire life was changed. And he decided to dedicate himself to trying to reverse Roe v. Wade and preventing the spread of permissive abortion. Well, the journal he founded, the Human Life Review, has thrived ever since, and it's become a clearinghouse for anti-abortion writing and for other bioethical issues from then right up to the present. One of the most powerful voices speaking out against abortion was a law professor at the University of California, Berkeley Law School, called John Noonan. And his book, A Private Choice, is probably the most powerful book ever written against the idea of legalized abortion. John Noonan thinks about it this way. He says, "The test of a society is its care for its most vulnerable and helpless people." And of course, he says, who could be more helpless than the people as yet unborn, who are totally dependent on the concern and mercy of their mothers? He emphatically denied that abortion was private, as the Supreme Court had said. After all, it's an operation which involved doctors and nurses and hospitals. That is, every abortion drew all kinds of other people into the necessary activity. John Noonan made two very powerful analogies. The first of them was with slavery. He compared the Roe versus Wade decision with the Dred Scott case of 1857. And he said, in the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court denied standing to a slave, and in doing so, it regarded an entire category of people as beyond the protection of the law. Now, Roe versus Wade is also denying an entire category of people as beyond the protection of the law. The first group, slaves because of their race, the second group because of their age. He also made the analogy with the Holocaust, the Nazi extermination of the Jews. Noonan says, the Nazis killed them not for what they had done, but for what they were. And that's what abortion does too. It doesn't consider the moral particularities of the people in question. It rather kills them because of their age. Well, these were two arguments much used by the anti-abortion movement from that time on, right up to the present. And John Noonan was emphatic about this point as well, that you don't have to be religious to see that abortions are wrong. He said, the more the science of embryology develops, the more clearly we can see that long before birth, it's justifiable to say that this is a person. He says, the one moment of objective discontinuity between mere biological material on the one hand and a human being on the other is the moment of conception. Because it's at conception that a distinct human being is fully genetically encoded. From that time forward, all the distinctive characteristics of the person have been brought together. And that ought to be the moment after which the embryo deserves the full protection of a human life. Anyway, Noonan was emphatic that although he was arguing from a religious point of view, he was a devout Catholic. Nevertheless, all these arguments should appeal not solely to religious people, but to everybody on secular grounds. Now, the evangelical Protestant churches of America had long been divided about whether to concentrate solely on saving individual souls or whether to be involved in social and political reform. At the time of the Scopes Monkey trial back in 1925, which I mentioned earlier in the course, many of the evangelical churches had tended to retreat into a concern principally for individual souls. One important group of the Protestant churches were the dispensational premillennialists. These were people who believed that the end of the world is very, very close. There were people who in the early 20th century had tried to chart biblical prophecies very accurately onto history and had concluded that the rapture was imminent. The rapture is the moment in which Jesus will return and will seize out of the world everyone who's already turned to him, leaving behind everybody else for 7 years of chaos and then finally the Battle of Armageddon before the return of Jesus. So these people, the dispensational premillennialists, took this view. If the end of the world is that close, worldly affairs, political affairs, don't matter all that much. Surely it's much more important to save souls, because that's going to be the decisive difference. Let's not worry about reforming the world. This was the theme of Hal Lindsey's book, The Late Great Planet Earth, one of the great bestsellers of the early 1970s, and also of Donald Thompson's movie, A Thief in the Night, from 1972, wildly popular among evangelicals in the 70s. But in the 1970s, a new point of view began to develop from inside the evangelical community, prompted particularly by the work of Francis Schaeffer, who lived from 1912 to 1984, who argued that it was necessary for evangelicals to save the world from Satan. He was a highly intellectual figure and was sceptical of Billy Graham-style revivalism, because he thought that when you convert to Christianity, you need to be in your right mind. You don't need to be emotionally exhilarated. Billy Graham worked in the tradition of the old revivalists, who have a long history in tradition in American history, of working people up into a condition of wild excitement and then getting them to commit to Jesus. Schaeffer's view was, no, you've got to be calm and rational, and you've got to commit intellectually to the faith. Schaeffer himself was reclusive. He lived in a mountain retreat in Switzerland called L'Abri, the shelter, to which Protestant pilgrims would go to seek out his wisdom. Schaeffer wrote a book in 1976 called How Should We Then Live? And he made a television series based on the book, emphasizing the disastrous triumph of what he called secular humanism in society, which had permitted abortion and pornography and the elimination of prayer from schools. All these, said Schaeffer, were instruments of the devil. Here's a quotation from Francis Schaeffer. 60 years ago, could we have imagined that unborn children would be killed by the millions here in our own country? Or that we would have no freedom of speech when it comes to speaking of God and biblical truth in our public schools? Or that every form of sexual perversion would be promoted by the entertainment media? Or that marriage, raising children and family life would be objects of attack? Sadly, we must say that very few Christians have understood the battle that we are in. Very few have taken a strong and courageous stand against the world spirit of this age as it destroys our culture and the Christian ethos that once shaped our country. Well, one of the people who heard this message was Jerry Falwell, a minister from Lynchburg, Virginia, and the founder of the Moral Majority in 1979. Falwell had been born back in 1933 and had had a profound born-again Christian conversion as a teenager. He created his own Southern Baptist church, originally in an old soft drinks bottling plant in Lynchburg, and almost at once began a radio ministry and then moved on to a TV ministry as well. Falwell was a charismatic preacher, soon generating large audiences in the church and among his TV audience. And he founded a Christian high school and then a college, the place which today is called Liberty Baptist University. Falwell's interesting because he's simultaneously backward-looking and forward-looking. Forward-looking in the sense that he had a sharp eye for the benefits of all the new technologies. He was one of the pioneers of evangelical television. But he used it to broadcast a show which was called the Old Time Gospel Hour, very heavy on conservative themes, and bringing to mind an imagined ideal time in the past when America had been a Christian nation with none of its current woes. So it's simultaneously using a new technology to generate a sense of nostalgia. Falwell also favoured the use of military imagery in thinking about the job that Christians had to do. Listen to this from one of his sermons. The local church is an organised army, equipped for battle, ready to charge the enemy. The Sunday school is the attacking squad. The church should be a disciplined, charging army. Christians, like slaves and soldiers, ask no questions. Ultimately, some Marines have to march in, encounter the enemy face to face, and put the flag up. I'm speaking of Marines who've been called by God to move in past the shelling, encounter the enemy face to face and one-on-one, bring them under submission to the gospel of Christ, move them into the household of God, put up the flag and call it secured. So the most vivid possible idea of Christian soldiers who must attack a society which, as he saw it, was totally alien to their interests and beliefs. Jerry Falwell was aided by a talented group, Paul Weyrich, Terry Dolan, Richard Viguerie and Howard Phillips. And together they built a powerful lobbying organisation, the Moral Majority. Richard Viguerie was the pioneer of direct mail fundraising in the era before the internet. He sent out mailings by the tens of thousands to elicit contributions from voters to campaigns on single issues or for particular candidates. And Viguerie discovered that it could be very, very effective, particularly if he was able to give a lurid simplification of the issue and make it sound as though the future of civilization was at stake. This was an effective way of raising funds from citizens. Weyrich, like Falwell, saw the lifestyle changes of the 1960s and 70s as a threat to the family as the basic institution of society. And he wrote, "What is behind the thrust against the traditional family values? Well, first of all, from our point of view, this is really the most significant battle of the age-old conflict between good and evil, between the forces of God and forces against God that we have seen in our country. We see the anti-family movement as an attempt to prevent souls from reaching eternal salvation. And as such, we feel not just a political commitment to change the situation, but a moral and, if you will, a religious commitment to battle these forces." Well, the politics of the late 1970s was paradoxical because even though President Carter was an evangelical Christian, the Moral Majority began campaigning against him and for the Republican candidate, Ronald Reagan, who didn't have an evangelical past. As a candidate in the election of 1976, Carter had been very outspoken about the fact that he was a born-again Christian and about the fact that he was a Sunday school teacher. It had surprised or even astonished many journalists and commentators who thought of politics as a very, very secular world, as it had been in the foregoing decades. But Carter, in the view of the Moral Majority, was compromised by the Democratic Party's pro-feminist, pro-Roe versus Wade and anti-school prayer positions. They asked him to change all these positions, but for party reasons, he as a Democratic president was unable to do so. The Moral Majority realised that it could have an immense effect on the outcome of elections. In 1976, a quarter of the whole population of America claimed to be born-again Christians. Well, that's more than 50 million potential votes. Although, of course, in practice, not all evangelicals followed the Moral Majority, and not all thought of themselves as politically conservative. Although there often is a congruence between evangelical Protestantism and conservatism, it isn't a necessary congruence, and there certainly are interesting evangelicals who've got a politically much more radical point of view. Well, the principal issues that concern the Moral Majority were negative issues: opposition to the ERA, opposition to feminism, opposition to abortion, and opposition to homosexuality. Moral Majority made the claim to represent Catholics and Jews as well, but was never able to be entirely convincing in that claim. For example, in August 1980, Reagan, when he was still a candidate 2 or 3 months before the election took place, spoke at the annual meeting of the Religious Roundtable. Another speaker at the same event was Bailey Smith, the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, and he said, "My friend God Almighty does not hear the prayers of a Jew. For how in the world can God hear the prayer of a man who says that Jesus Christ is not the true Messiah? It is blasphemy. It may be politically expedient, but no one can pray unless he prays through the name of Jesus Christ." Well, Falwell and a sympathetic rabbi hastily met to draft a statement disavowing Smith's remarks and affirming that God hears the prayers of everybody. They could imagine that this could be an electoral catastrophe if Reagan's name was closely associated with a man who on principle was religiously intolerant in that way. Another developing aspect of the religious and political controversies of the late 70s and early 80s was the work of the creation scientists. These were people who simultaneously campaigned against the teaching of evolutionary biology in public schools. They believed the Bible to be God's word. They believed the Bible to be infallible. And therefore they couldn't believe the evolutionary explanation of human origins. After all, the first few chapters of the book of Genesis say how the earth was created. And if the Bible says it, and if the Bible is infallible, that must be the description. The idea that humans had evolved out of other species was to them intolerable. Now, early in the 1960s, the Supreme Court had made a succession of decisions on First Amendment grounds, excluding religious teaching from public schools. And that put the creation scientists in a difficult position. Ironically, they had to pretend that they were not advancing a religious point of view, but only a scientific one. The Creation Science Research Institute in San Diego gathered together a group of science PhDs to advance their case with the claim that it was a scientific case they were making, not a religious one. But in test cases in the states of Arkansas and Louisiana, they lost anyway. The judiciary was convinced that this was in fact a religious point of view whose impetus came not from scientific experiments, but from the Bible, and from an attempt to retrospectively make the scientific evidence fit the Bible story. Unfavourable court decisions prompted many Christian conservatives to advocate homeschooling instead, and this was the beginning of the homeschooling movement, or at least a great contribution to it, from evangelicals who felt that the public schools themselves were a hostile environment to their real interests. Once Reagan was elected in the election of November 1980, his administration proved a disappointment to Christian conservatives because they found it very difficult in practice to gain congressional support for their objectives. The libertarian side of the new conservatism objected to legislation on moral questions. The whole emphasis of libertarianism was on government leaving citizens alone and letting them make up their own minds about what they did in almost every possible matter. They didn't want this kind of intrusiveness. Besides, the abortion question did not line up along the axis that divides Republicans and Democrats. There were millions of pro-choice Republicans, and there were millions of pro-life Democrats. And of course that meant that any candidate, any politician, had an enormous incentive not to talk about the issue at all, because he or she knew that whatever they said would cost them votes. With issues like that, the candidates above all want not to talk about the issue. So it wasn't possible to get a Republican bill outlawing abortion. A minister named Randall Terry created Operation Rescue, in the hope that massive disobedience would force the issue. Operation Rescue was founded in 1987, and Randall Terry was an evangelical preacher from upstate New York. He'd learned confrontational techniques from Joseph Scheidler. Scheidler had been the founder of the Pro-Life Action League. This was a Catholic anti-abortion group. And Scheidler had worked out various techniques for closing down abortion clinics. He himself and his friends would chain themselves to the door. They'd lock the doors of clinics and chain themselves to the doors, or chain themselves to concrete blocks, literally making it impossible for people to get in and out of the clinics. They practiced what was called sidewalk counselling. That is, approaching women who are going to the clinics for abortions. And they courted mass arrest. The high point of Operation Rescue's work came at the Democratic Convention in Atlanta in 1988, where hundreds of them were arrested, packing the jails. This, of course, was picking up a technique which had originally been used in the early 1960s by Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. And the very fact that they're using techniques of this kind makes them conservative only in a very paradoxical sense. Taking to the streets means provoking a political crisis, not the normal preferred method of conservative groups. Well, the evangelical scandals of the later 1980s damaged the credibility of the Christian right. Jim and Tammy Baker, sentimental Christian broadcasters, defrauded thousands of people of their savings by promoting Christian theme park timeshare schemes which couldn't possibly work. Tens of millions of dollars was absorbed into the Bakers' personal empire, and eventually they were ruined by it, and Jim was forced to go to prison. Similarly, Jimmy Swaggart, a Louisiana evangelist, was caught with a prostitute, and his ministry was correspondingly dented, to say the least. Falwell, who was horrified by these developments, tried to run damage control, just as he had done back in 1980. But by 1990, the image of evangelical Christianity, particularly the idea of coming in to have to clean up the political mess, had meant that the evangelical cause as a political contributor had been fatally contaminated. Ralph Reed's Christian Coalition took over from the moral majority in the early 1990s, and it concentrated on grassroots organisation, whereas Falwell's moral majority had been a centralised lobby, principally a Washington lobby. The Christian Coalition was at the grassroots. Its idea was, let's get our members onto school boards, into local government. Let's fight for Christian and conservative principles in the localities. It encountered the dilemma of having to choose between candidates who are most likely to win and those with the right convictions. The nature of the American political system encourages moderation, and so the candidates who are most likely to win are those who don't have very, very sharp and divisive opinions. That remained a dilemma for the Christian Coalition. Well, the events of the 1970s and 80s had brought evangelical Christians into organised conservative politics as an important factor, even while the nature of the American political system had limited their effectiveness.